Hello aspirants, welcome back to Believers IAS Academy. In today's topic of the day, we will be discussing about the President of India as a part of topic of the high yielding topics discussion for Prelims 2026, and we were doing President in the past few videos, and this is a continuation. So let's start from question number 16. So the question goes, which amendment made presidential assent to constitutional amendment bills compulsory? Well, the answer is 24th Constitutional Amendment Act in the year 1971 made the presidential assent, which is very compulsory for any constitutional amendment act. But before this amendment, we have to understand that there were a lot of uncertainty whether the president can either give the assent or can refuse his assent, especially for a constitution amendment bill passed as a part of Article 368. However, this amendment inserted an explicit wording in Article 368 which stated that President shall give assent removing any scope of discretion and confusion whatsoever. And the important article is important constitutional amendment is 24th Constitutional Amendment Act of 1971. So this basically means that no absolute veto or suspensive veto or pocket veto is applicable for a constitutional amendment bill with respect to president, and president acts as a formal authority, not a decision maker. Means even president is also the part and parcel of parliament, or let's say the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, in terms of passing this particular constitutional amendment bill. So he acts as a formal authority where he must give his signature, right? He must assent, and no absolute veto, no suspensive veto, and no pocket veto. So basically, he is not a decision maker, but rather he has to say yes. He has to nod his head for the views of the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha with respect to this constitutional amendment bill. So in a sense, constitutional amendment is equal to parliament's supremacy, and it's not the president's discretion. Next question, is the president bound to give assent to state bill if it is repassed after reconsideration? So we have studied this when we studied about Article 200 when discussing about the governor as well. However, we will study once again when a state bill is reserved for the president by the governor under Article 200 and 201. So the president basically has three different options. One is he can give his assent. Second is withhold his assent, and third one, he can return the bill, and this he can do only if it is a money bill. But rather, if the state legislature now repasses the bill after reconsideration, now there is no compulsion on the president that he has to give his assent. Rather, he can even withhold his assent, right? So he can still withhold his assent indefinitely. Means he can exercise pocket veto with respect to state legislature bills. However, this scenario is different from the parliamentary bills, where if the parliament, the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, let's say after when the president resends the bill for reconsideration and they pass it again, the president must give his assent. So this reflects a unitary tilt in Indian federalism. Very important thing to keep in mind, because UPSC can give you these kind of topics as a part of statement based questions where reasoning and assertion. So these are the very important reasons why you have to remember as in what this depicts. So this depicts or this reflects the unitary tilt in Indian federalism. This is also very important from the prelims point of view, which you have to know the reason as well. And the center retains final control over state legislation in certain cases. I hope it is clear. Now let's move on to the next question. Under what conditions can the president promulgate an ordinance? Is his satisfaction subject to judicial review? Well, ordinance making power of the president is Article 123 or 123 of the Indian Constitution, which usually is invoked when an urgent legislation situation arises in a country, and also when both the houses of parliament is also not in session. So also I can say the conditions required for president to give or legislate through ordinance is when both the houses of parliament, the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, both are not in session, and a situation must also be present that that demands that immediate intervention by the president in terms of legislation, right? So even lockdown during the COVID was also kind of an ordinance issued by the president because of the situation which was demanded back then, right? So one important thing to remember that in terms of putting or let's say in terms of legislating through ordinance, one thing is very much important, that one of the house, even if Rajya Sabha is in session, ordinance cannot be issued. Even if Lok Sabha is in session, ordinance cannot be issued, right? So basically, when both the houses are not in session, and let's say even if one session or one of the houses in session, ordinance cannot be issued, right? So that is one of the important conditions, and this ensures that ordinance is not a bypass for the parliament. Because how does any legislation happen? So first, a bill has to be introduced either in the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha, and after when the bill gets the sufficient let's say support from either of the two houses, then it passes to the subsequent next house, and from there it goes to the president, and then it becomes a law. So this is how a particular bill becomes an act or probably a law. But ordinance is not a situation where it has to bypass these filters. Rather, just the president, you know, writes it in a piece of paper and calls it an ordinance, and then it becomes a law, right? So basically, this is the safeguard that the constitution is brought in terms of making sure, in terms of compelling that even if one house in session, ordinance cannot be issued, or the necessary requirement is that both the houses of parliament must be in session, right? So that is also must not be in session. So that is also one of the important safety valve the constitution has put with respect to ordinance, as it shouldn't be used as a bypass to the parliament. Next, you have to keep in mind with respect to the early understanding that the president's satisfaction was seen as final, and also it was non-justiciable in nature as well. However, the present situation, if we have to see, the president's satisfaction can be challenged in the court on the grounds of malified intention, abuse of power, and lack of genuine urgency. And also a very important case, DC Wadhwa and State of Bihar 1987, the Supreme Court criticized repeated promulgation of ordinance, and it even said that repeated repromulgation of the same ordinance can also be considered as fraud happening to the constitution, right? So that is also one important instance. So basically, ordinance power is not absolute, rather it is controlled by judiciary and parliament as well. So judiciary also controls the ordinance making power, and also it's the parliament. So this thing you have to remember. What is the scope and limitation of ordinance power regarding state list, fundamental rights, and constitutional amendment? Well, ordinance has the same force effect as an act of parliament. So that is the reason why that safety valve has been put, making sure that both the houses shouldn't be in session, and only then ordinance can be issued, right? Because ordinance has that power, it has the same force and effect as an act of parliament, but obviously temporarily, because especially, if you have to see, once after the ordinance is let's say ordinance is issued, and then let's say the particular state or let's say the country is following based on that ordinance. And now once after let's say maybe because of some particular situation, let's say COVID, right? So now the COVID ended, but the lockdown or let's say certain restrictions that were put based on movement of the people, that can still be effective, that can still remain, right? It ultimately depends on the parliament later when they convene, they can either change it, right? So basically it is a temporary legislation, but also has the similar effect and force of any act of the parliament. Now, with respect to stateless, does it have the same limitations, or what is the scope? Well, the president can promulgate ordinances even on the state list. The answer is yes, because parliament itself can legislate in certain situations, and ordinance pretty much simulates the same power that parliament is having with respect to legislating in terms of state list. And in terms of fundamental rights, ordinance cannot violate any fundamental rights that is there, and if it does, it can be struck down by the courts. Judicial review is still applicable. And in terms of constitutional amendment, ordinance cannot amend the constitution. So an ordinance cannot be issued to amend the constitution, because constitutional amendment can happen only on certain restrictions. First is it has to be happening, or it has to happen only through the special procedure under Article 368 with a special majority, right? I mean, in fact, even amendment can also happen through simple majority, special majority, and all of that. But however, it has to happen under Article 368 of the Constitution, which has certain special procedures. And basically, the idea is that ordinance is temporary legislative tool and not a substitute for constitutional and fundamental changes. This statement is also important from the ordinance topic. Next is, what is the duration of an ordinance? When does it lapse? And what happens to actions taken under it? Well, the maximum life of an ordinance is 6 months and 6 weeks, right? Valid for 6 weeks from the reassembly of the parliament. And it can lapse in two situations. if not approved within 6 weeks of the assembly, if after that they reassemble within 6 weeks, if they are not approving it, then the ordinance can lapse. And if both houses passes a resolution disapproving it, even then it will lapse. And in terms of promulgation, reissuing the same ordinance repeatedly without getting the parliamentary approval is considered to be unconstitutional and a fraud on the constitution. And this was said in Krishna Kumar Singh versus State of Bihar 2017. And also there is another important thing, that acts done under ordinance are generally valid even after lapse under the principle of past and closed transactions. So this is also very important, you have to know. And ordinance is temporary, but its effects can continue, which makes it a powerful tool. And hence we have so many restrictions, so many safeguards, and also a lot of provisions with respect to ordinance. Next question: is the ordinance making power of the president discretionary? Well, this is a very important philosophical kind of a question, or kind of a thinker, because in theory, if you see, constitution says that the president can promulgate ordinances, but however, under Article 74 of the Indian Constitution, President does not have an independence, or does not have his own arena where he can exercise his powers. Rather, he acts on the advice of the Council of Ministers, which means President cannot act independently, right, in issuing anything or withdrawing any ordinance. So basically, it is the Council of Ministers headed by Prime Minister who is advising the president to do certain things, even for that matter the ordinance. So real authority lies with the cabinet and not with the president, even in terms of ordinance making power. So hence we can also say that ordinance power is not discretionary but executive driven. So that's all for this particular video. I hope you have liked the video, and we will have probably one more video discussing the president chapter, and then we will be done with the president chapter. Anyway, that's all for this particular video. Signing off, this is Madan Gopal.